The key clicked heavily in the lock as Mark pushed open the door, stepping into a house shrouded in silence. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. Another late evening, a quiet home. Maybe the faint hum of the TV from the living room where Jenna, his wife, would usually be waiting, half lost in a book. But tonight, there was only silence, thick and cold, with the faintest trace of vanilla in the air, like someone had hurriedly tried to cover up another scent. A scent that didn't belong. Jenna wasn't here. The kitchen was dim and empty, not a single sign of her. No phone charging, no half-filled glass on the table. And strangest of all, there wasn't the usual plate of leftovers waiting for him. Instead, the counter looked eerily clean, as if scrubbed of every trace of their life. Mark's eyes swept the room, his gut twisting with a feeling he couldn't quite place. Something was off. Very off. He took a slow step toward the living room, looking around as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the shadows. But no one came. The silence seemed to deepen with every step he took, and a strange chill crept up his spine. Maybe she'd just gone out to run an errand, he reasoned. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. His mind flashed to the past few weeks. Jenna had been different lately, distracted, distant. She'd started coming home later and later, saying her boss, Eric, needed her help with a big art installation at the gallery. But each time he asked about it, her answers seemed too vague, too rehearsed. Her late-night whispers on the phone, the long showers as soon as she got home, the new perfume he'd never seen before. All these pieces began to connect, forming a picture he wasn't ready to see. Mark felt his chest tighten, a mix of dread and something darker, a deep, burning suspicion gnawing at him, one he couldn't keep ignoring. He turned to head upstairs, a cold determination hardening in him as he made his way to their bedroom. He opened the door, but before he even stepped inside, something caught his eye, a small glint of metal on the floor. Bending down, he picked up a delicate bracelet with a broken clasp, one he'd never seen Jenna wear. He turned it over in his hands, his jaw clenching. It wasn't hers. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless, reeling. This wasn't some forgotten piece of jewelry from years past. It was new, and someone had worn it in this very room. Someone who wasn't him. A surge of anger rose within him, hot and uncontrollable. He felt his fists clench, his heartbeat thunder in his ears. This wasn't a misunderstanding. He was staring at the cold, brutal evidence of someone else in his home, someone who'd left this behind in a hurry. Mark had known, deep down, that something was wrong, but he hadn't expected it to slap him across the face like this. Mark's mind raced as he stood there, frozen, clutching the foreign bracelet in his hand. The house seemed to close in around him, walls tightening, shadows looming. His breathing grew shallow. He needed to see. He needed proof beyond this single, damning piece of jewelry. He walked to the bed, eyes scanning for any other clues, something he might have missed. On her side of the bed, her phone was lying face down on the nightstand. A glowing screen revealed a notification, but his hands hovered, hesitant. This was her private space, her phone. They'd always trusted each other, never snooped. But trust was no longer a luxury he could afford. He reached for the phone, fingers trembling as he unlocked it. Her password was still the same as when they'd first moved into the house. A part of him had hoped he'd be stopped by a changed code, a sign that this was all in his head. But the phone unlocked easily, opening a world he wasn't sure he wanted to see. A message flashed across the screen, glaring in the darkness. Tonight was incredible. Can't wait to see you again. His pulse spiked, fury building within him. He scrolled through her messages, reading the conversations in horror, his worst suspicions unraveling in brutal detail before his eyes. It was her boss, Eric. Every affectionate nickname, every heated confession, every plan made behind his back hit Mark like a fist to the gut. He stumbled back, unable to believe the words she'd written to another man, words he thought she reserved only for him. Eric had been at their house for dinner last Christmas, sharing wine and laughing with them both like he was an old friend. And now, every memory of those evenings twisted into something dark and vile. Mark's grip tightened around the phone as he continued to scroll. Dates and times scrolled past, each one etched into his mind. She'd been with Eric on nights when she told him she was working late. Those nights he'd waited for her, feeling lonely but proud, supportive of her career. She'd been out, lying in someone else's arms. He dropped the phone back onto the nightstand, a hot wave of anger and betrayal flooding his mind. He had given everything to this life, to her, building a home and a future on a foundation he thought was rock solid. All of it, every sacrifice, every late night, every hard-won piece of their life together, felt like a cruel joke. Unable to bear the sight of the room any longer, he stormed out and made his way downstairs. He paced the living room, fists clenching and unclenching. The ache in his chest burned hotter with every thought. He remembered their wedding day, the way she'd looked at him with what he thought was pure love. He remembered the nights they'd spent talking about the future, the family they'd planned to have together. Was any of it real? Or had she simply been wearing a mask all along? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a recent slip-up or a mistake. This was something deeper, something she'd chosen to pursue while smiling at him over breakfast, lying next to him at night. It was as though she'd erased him from her life without a second thought, left him in the dark while she shared herself with another man. As he paced, his eyes landed on a photo on the wall. Their anniversary trip to the lake. She was smiling, arms wrapped around him as they posed by the water. The memory twisted now, tainted by the betrayal he could no longer ignore. He could almost see Eric's shadow lurking behind every laugh, every tender moment. It wasn't just anger that filled him now, but a deep, consuming hatred he barely recognized. But the hatred wasn't just for Eric. It was for her too. For the lies, the empty promises, the way she'd taken everything he'd given her and thrown it away. He could feel himself teetering on the edge of something dark, a place he'd never wanted to go. And yet, standing there in the silence of his home, the home they'd built together, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't just walk away and let them have their affair in peace. They had trampled on everything he'd worked for, everything he dreamed of. He was going to make them feel every ounce of the pain they'd caused him, every shred of betrayal they'd so carelessly inflicted. An idea began to take shape in his mind. It was reckless, dangerous even, but it was the only way he could make sense of this, the only way he could take back control over the mess that had become his life. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but the thought of sitting idle, of simply fading into the background while they continued their affair, was unbearable. With each passing second, his resolve hardened. Mark wasn't going to be a victim, not in his own life. He would confront Jenna, confront Eric, on his terms, on his turf. He'd make sure they knew just what they had done to him. Mark sat in the living room, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed as he processed what he'd discovered. The phone lay in his hand, heavy with the weight of everything it revealed. The texts, the plans, the intimate moments shared with another man. Jenna had never been unfaithful to him before, or so he had thought. But now, staring at the blatant evidence, he realized he'd been fooling himself. He'd ignored the signs, brushed off the late nights and the hollow excuses, convincing himself it was just work stress, maybe a rough patch. But now, the truth was staring him down, as raw and brutal as a knife to the chest. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built his life with had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. It was like he'd been living in someone else's nightmare, and now, every painful detail was being revealed, shattering the illusion of their life together. The air felt thick as he tried to make sense of it all. Each text echoed in his mind, each "I miss you," each "can't wait to see you again," words that had once belonged to him, that she had once whispered to him in the early days of their marriage. Now, they were hollow phrases she offered freely to another man. He clenched his fists, feeling a surge of rage, so intense it almost scared him. But the anger was nothing compared to the humiliation. She'd laughed with him, planned with him, even shared their future, all while hiding this sordid secret. How many times had she looked him in the eye, knowing she was lying? The realization sent a bitter chill through him. This wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was a betrayal of everything they'd built, every promise they'd made to each other. Mark rose from the couch, pacing as if movement would release the tension coiled tight within him. The more he thought about it, the more it consumed him, until the need for answers overwhelmed every other thought. He needed to know how long this had been going on, just how deep her betrayal went, and he needed to hear it from her. He wasn't going to sit in silence, suffering alone while she continued to play her game. His eyes fell on the hallway leading to their bedroom. He started walking, each step fueled by a simmering fury. He'd confront her, make her look him in the eye and explain herself. She had no right to hide anymore. He dragged the truth out of her, even if it left their marriage in ruins. But as he reached their bedroom door, he stopped, hand hovering over the doorknob. He wanted to burst in, to force the confrontation now, but a dark, twisted sense of curiosity held him back. Instead, he backed away, deciding to wait, to gather more. If he confronted her now, she'd likely lie, spin another story, try to worm her way out. No, he needed a plan. If she thought he was clueless, he'd let her. He'd bide his time, gather every piece of evidence, and then lay it all out, exposing her lies one by one. He headed back to the living room and poured himself a drink, the liquor burning as it slid down his throat. It did nothing to ease the rage boiling inside him, but it gave him the moment of quiet he needed to think. His mind raced, forming a plan, a twisted sense of purpose taking root. This wouldn't end here. He'd make sure she felt the weight of her actions, that she regretted every lie she'd told, every secret she'd kept. Mark began to comb through her things, taking his time, moving through their home like a detective in his own life. He searched her drawers, her bag, found another phone, a burner phone she'd hidden away, no doubt for her communications with Eric. His lips curled into a grim smile as he flipped through the messages, scrolling through details that deepened his disgust. They had dates, secret weekends. He read the times she'd kissed him goodbye, only to rush to meet her lover. It was all there, neatly documented in the messages she'd thought would stay hidden. Each message was like a dagger, deepening the wound, but it also fed the dark satisfaction building inside him. She'd underestimated him, thought he'd never suspect. Well, he'd show her just how wrong she was. In the following days, Mark played his part well. He kept his anger buried, his expression carefully blank each time he looked at her. Every good morning, laced with bitter resentment that he hid behind a mask. He even kissed her goodbye each morning, watching her walk out the door, knowing she was likely heading to Eric. He allowed himself that private satisfaction, knowing he knew and she had no clue what was coming. With each passing day, his plan solidified. He'd confront her, but not until he was ready, not until he had every shred of evidence he needed. He set up surveillance, even hired a private investigator, wanting details he couldn't get on his own. It was a twisted game he was playing, watching from the shadows as she wove herself deeper into her own trap. There was a perverse satisfaction in it, a sense of control he hadn't felt in weeks. Every secret he uncovered only added fuel to his resolve. This was no longer just about her betrayal. It was about reclaiming his life, taking back the power she'd stolen from him with her lies. And when the time came, he'd make sure she understood the depths of his pain. He'd make her see just what she had destroyed. And as he gathered the final pieces, preparing for the confrontation, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This would end on his terms. Days passed, and Mark could feel the anger carving itself into his soul. It was like a wildfire smoldering just beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to set it ablaze. He couldn't look at Jenna without feeling the weight of her betrayal, the suffocating sting of every lie she had spun around him. Each morning, as he watched her leave the house with a casual kiss on his cheek, he felt a fury rising, barely contained. He would stand by the window, watching her drive off, knowing where she was really going, who she was really going to meet. He clenched his fists, jaw tight as he thought of all the ways he could confront her, the words he'd throw at her, the accusations that burned in his throat. He wanted to shake her, to make her see the wreckage she'd left him in. He envisioned grabbing her by the shoulders, demanding she tell him why she had shattered everything they'd built together, why she had chosen to betray him in the ugliest way possible. But with each passing day, a new thought began to gnaw at him. Was confrontation really enough? Would standing in front of her, screaming out his hurt and betrayal, give him the closure he needed? Or would it leave him even emptier, a hollow shell, while she simply walked away? It wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. Revenge. The word slipped into his mind, dark and enticing, offering him the kind of satisfaction that a simple confrontation couldn't. He knew it was dangerous, that once he went down this path, there would be no turning back. But his rage was a force too powerful to ignore, whispering to him that he deserved justice, that she deserved to feel every ounce of pain she had inflicted on him. He'd spent years giving her everything he had, and now he wanted something back. He wanted her to suffer. He wrestled with himself, caught between the man he used to be and the man he was becoming. The thought of revenge was seductive, intoxicating, promising a release he couldn't find in any other form. But a small, fading part of him hesitated, reminding him of the life they once shared, the love that had once bound them together. It was almost laughable, really, the idea of holding on to any kind of loyalty now, after what she'd done. But still, that sliver of decency, of restraint, fought against the darker urges coursing through him. As he paced the living room, thoughts of vengeance filling his mind, he considered his options. He could expose her, drag her affair into the light for everyone to see, humiliate her the way she'd humiliated him. He could make sure everyone knew what she was, what kind of person they were really dealing with. He could ruin her reputation, destroy her standing, make her feel as worthless as she had made him feel. The idea thrilled him, a bitter satisfaction spreading through his chest. Or perhaps something more personal, something that would hit her where it hurt most. She loved her career, her carefully curated image as a cultured, respectable woman, devoted to art and community. If he could strip that away, leave her in ruins, he'd finally see her suffer. The thought of watching her crumble under the weight of her own shame gave him a grim satisfaction he'd never felt before. Yet, as he entertained these dark fantasies, something inside him twisted. He wasn't this person. He had never been one to destroy for the sake of it, never given in to his darker impulses. He'd always believed in fairness, in integrity, had prided himself on his ability to hold back, to take the higher road. But now, all of that seemed like a distant memory, the values of a man who'd been naive, a man who'd thought he understood love and trust. He poured himself a drink, sinking into his chair as he tried to sort through the chaos in his mind. How far was he willing to go? What would revenge really accomplish? Would it bring him the peace he so desperately craved? Or would it consume him entirely, leaving him hollow and broken? The struggle churned within him, each thought clashing violently with the next. Part of him wanted to walk away, to pack his things, leave her to rot in her lies, and start a new life free from her deceit. But another part, the part now hardened and twisted by the pain she'd caused, wanted to stay, to confront, to destroy. He wanted to look her in the eyes and watch her face as she realized he knew everything, every sordid detail of her betrayal. At times, he found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at a reflection he hardly recognized. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his jaw clenched tight, his shoulders tense. This man was a stranger, a shell of who he'd once been, molded by anger and bitterness. And he couldn't deny the satisfaction it brought him, the thrill of embracing this new, unforgiving version of himself. The internal war raged on, pushing him closer and closer to a decision that he knew would change him forever. He could either turn back, salvage what was left of his old life, or give himself over to the darkness entirely, letting it guide his every move. And the more he thought about it, the clearer his path became. There would be no forgiveness, no second chances, no redemption. Jenna had taken that choice from him the moment she betrayed him. He would be the judge, the jury, and if necessary, the executioner of their so-called love. His heart was too scarred, his trust too broken to ever heal. He was past the point of saving, and as the final embers of his old self flickered out, Mark felt a new purpose solidify within him. He would find a way to make her pay, to exact his revenge in a way she'd never see coming. The struggle was over. He'd made his choice. Mark's decision to exact revenge settled over him like cold steel, hardening his resolve. He would not back down. He'd do what Jenna and her lover would never expect. Strike with precision, make every move count, and leave them with no place to hide. Yet he knew that charging in with fists swinging would only expose his rage. No, he needed to be smart, calculated. If he wanted to make her suffer, to make Eric suffer, he'd need a plan so airtight that they would never see it coming. The first step was simple. Stay quiet, observe, gather everything he needed to turn their lives upside down. Mark took a deep breath, channeling the fury into focus. He would play the loving husband a little while longer, let her continue under the illusion that he was blissfully unaware, that he was still her fool. The thought disgusted him, but he pushed it down. If this was going to work, he'd have to act as though he was none the wiser. As days turned into weeks, Mark carefully gathered evidence. He documented every late night, every whispered phone call. He kept screenshots of their messages, each one a nail in the coffin of their deception. He even managed to snap a few pictures of Jenna and Eric meeting up in a quiet cafe across town, leaning too close, hands touching under the table. Each new piece of evidence was both a victory and a torment, feeding his rage while inching him closer to his goal. Mark knew Jenna had a few weak points, vulnerabilities she had always kept tightly guarded. Her career was her pride and joy, her reputation in the art community carefully curated and upheld. If word got out that she was having an affair with her married boss, it would send shockwaves through the gallery, possibly even end her career. That was his in, her weakness, her blind spot. He would bring her down in the very world she had fought so hard to build, leaving her with nothing. But Mark wanted Eric to suffer just as much, if not more. Eric, with his charm and smirking confidence, had seduced his wife, made her betray everything they'd built. And he'd done it so easily, right under Mark's nose. Mark could still picture that smug face, the way Eric looked at Jenna like she was his prize. It made his blood boil. No, Mark wouldn't leave Eric unscathed. He would feel the weight of this betrayal too. One evening, an idea struck him, simple yet devastating. He would destroy Eric's life from the inside out. He began digging into Eric's personal affairs, searching for any dirt, any hint of impropriety. Mark started with the gallery's finances, knowing that someone like Eric, who took what he wanted without thought for consequence, likely had skeletons hidden away. He quietly reached out to a contact in accounting, an old friend from high school who owed him a favor. With a little bit of digging, Mark uncovered more than he dared to hope. Eric had been siphoning money from the gallery, diverting funds under vague expenses, padding his own accounts without a second thought. It was enough to trigger a major investigation, enough to ruin Eric's career and reputation, maybe even send him to prison. Mark's hands clenched into fists, satisfaction swirling with the simmering rage. He had them. He had them both right where he wanted. But he wouldn't strike yet. Not until he had every single piece in place, until his trap was inescapable. The next step was to make Jenna feel the consequences of her betrayal in a way she couldn't ignore. Mark knew that she loved her social standing, the friendships she'd formed through the gallery, her polished image. So he made a list. People in her inner circle, people she counted on to support her, to boost her up. And one by one, he set out to plant the seeds of doubt among them. He started subtly, dropping hints in conversations with a few of their mutual friends, suggesting Jenna was going through something. He mentioned her long hours, her preoccupation with work. The gossip took on a life of its own, spreading faster than he'd expected. Reaching Jenna's closest friends, the ones who never missed an opportunity to indulge in a scandal. Soon, her friends began to ask questions, to wonder why she'd been so absent, why she seemed so distant. Mark smiled to himself, knowing it was only a matter of time before Jenna felt the walls closing in on her. The next step was to confront Jenna, but he wouldn't do it directly, not yet. Instead, he decided to send a message, a warning she couldn't ignore. Late one night, while she was asleep, he slipped her phone from her nightstand and crafted a single, carefully worded text to Eric. "I know what you're doing. It ends now." The message wasn't signed, but he knew the words alone would be enough to plant fear in both of them. The next morning, he watched her reaction carefully, waiting to see if she'd betray any sign that she knew something was wrong. Jenna's smile was tighter than usual, her gaze flickering to her phone as if expecting it to ring with bad news at any moment. Mark felt a savage satisfaction. She was finally beginning to feel the heat. In the days that followed, Jenna became more withdrawn, her laughter brittle, her demeanor tense. She and Eric exchanged fewer messages, their once frequent meetups growing sparse. The paranoia was eating at them, pulling them apart bit by bit, just as he'd planned. But Mark wasn't done. He was just getting started. He scheduled a meeting with a lawyer, someone with a reputation for dismantling lives with ruthless precision. He wanted his assets protected, his side of things fortified before he took the final step. And he wanted Jenna to be blindsided when the storm finally hit. The plan was almost ready. All that remained was for him to set it in motion. He would make them believe they'd gotten away with it, that they'd managed to hide their sins, only to watch their lives unravel when they least expected it. And as he stood in the darkness of his living room, the only sound his own steady breathing, he felt a grim sense of triumph. They had underestimated him, underestimated his resolve, his capacity to strike back. But soon they'd know, beyond a doubt, the price of their betrayal. The trap was ready. Now, all he had to do was wait for the moment to spring it. Mark's trap was set, but the final blow had yet to be delivered. Each day, he watched Jenna with cold precision, seeing her strain under the pressure he'd carefully orchestrated. The paranoia he'd planted was taking root, but something in her seemed to be shifting. She grew cautious, almost nervous, canceling plans and coming home earlier. The once frequent messages to Eric slowed to a trickle, and she became restless, checking her phone more often, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. His plan was working, until an unexpected twist appeared to throw everything into question. One morning, Mark noticed her sitting quietly at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tapping against her coffee mug, her eyes distant and troubled. She was early, much earlier than he expected, and she looked tired, almost worn down. A strange tension hung in the air between them, one he hadn't felt before. Jenna seemed to be struggling with something, as if burdened by a weight she hadn't yet shared. Then she looked up at him, a hint of vulnerability in her gaze that took him by surprise. "Mark," she started, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "we need to talk. There's something I need to tell you." He felt his heart rate spike, though he maintained a mask of indifference, his face unreadable. Was this it? Was she about to confess everything, finally ready to admit her betrayal? He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear her say it, to watch her try and justify the lies and the deceit. But he nodded, gesturing for her to continue, his gaze piercing, his silence unforgiving. "I've been struggling," she said slowly, her eyes avoiding his. "With us. With everything, really. I know I haven't been present, that I've neglected things. And I know you've noticed." She took a shaky breath, as if preparing to say more, but hesitated. Mark watched her, his anger simmering beneath the surface. This was a new tactic, one he hadn't anticipated. Was she trying to lay the groundwork for an excuse, to frame her actions as the result of a vague unhappiness, hoping he would forgive her before she revealed the full extent of her betrayal? His fingers tightened around his coffee mug, willing himself to stay calm, to not betray any hint of the rage burning within him. "You're right," he said finally, his tone cold. "I've noticed. But I didn't expect you to come to me about it." He forced himself to keep his voice steady, his words sharp. "So what is it, Jenna? What do you want to tell me?" She swallowed, looking down at her hands, and for a moment he almost saw a flicker of remorse, a trace of the woman he once loved. "I think maybe I haven't been the person I should be," she murmured, barely audible. "And I know I've hurt you, Mark. I didn't want things to get this way, but it feels like we're strangers now." Mark's anger twisted into something darker, a cold satisfaction mixed with bitter irony. She was dancing around the truth, desperate to absolve herself without facing the consequences. She hadn't mentioned Eric, hadn't even hinted at her infidelity. No, she was trying to manipulate him, to shift the blame onto the distance between them, hoping he'd forgive her without ever uncovering the full truth. It was a coward's confession. "So, what's your solution?" he asked, voice tight, suppressing the urge to laugh. "Are we just supposed to pretend everything's fine?" Jenna shook her head, a shadow passing over her face. "No, I want to try. I want us to work on this, to find our way back." Her voice trembled slightly. "I don't want to lose you, Mark. Not like this." He studied her, a bitter smile forming on his lips. It was almost insulting, the way she assumed he would simply forgive her, that a few words of regret would be enough to erase the lies and betrayal. She was asking him to rebuild their life on a foundation of deception, expecting him to accept it all without question. But then, a thought struck him, a twist he hadn't considered. What if he gave her the chance to rebuild? What if he played the role of the forgiving husband, the man who was willing to overlook everything for the sake of their marriage? He could string her along, let her believe she was safe, let her think that he'd forgiven her. And then, when she least expected it, he'd strike with the full weight of his plan. He'd make her feel secure, only to rip it all away, leaving her to face the consequences in front of everyone she tried so hard to impress. "Yes," he said slowly, his tone softening. "Maybe we can work on it. If you're willing to be honest with me, to really talk things through." He forced a note of warmth into his voice, watching her carefully as relief washed over her face. She actually believed him. She thought he would overlook everything, that he was weak enough to forgive. Jenna's face softened, a small smile breaking through her troubled expression. "Thank you, Mark. I didn't expect you to understand, but I'm glad." She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his, and he let her, swallowing down the bile that rose in his throat at her touch. For the next few days, Mark played his part perfectly. He was attentive, gentle, as though he was slowly forgiving her, allowing her to believe they were working things out. He watched as her relief grew, as she began to relax, falling back into their routines. And with each passing day, he tightened the snare, collecting the final pieces of his plan, knowing that soon he would unleash the reckoning she had no idea was coming. In those moments, he almost pitied her. She didn't know the full extent of the storm building around her, the devastation he was about to unleash. But that pity was fleeting, buried under the cold satisfaction that she was right where he wanted her. His patience was paying off, his trap primed to close on them both. The moment was close. All he had to do was wait for the right time to strike. The day Mark had waited for had finally arrived. The trap was set, every detail meticulously laid out, every contingency planned. His patience, his careful control, had paid off, and now, the weight of their betrayal was about to fall on Jenna and Eric in one calculated blow. There would be no escape, no chance to defend themselves. Today, they would answer for everything. Mark had chosen this setting carefully. The gallery, Jenna's sanctuary, the place she held most dear. Tonight, an important art exhibit would open. A high-profile event filled with patrons, collectors, and the people Jenna had spent years cultivating for her image. Eric would be there too, of course, hosting alongside her. And Mark would be waiting. Hours before the event, Mark arrived, carrying a folder thick with the evidence he had amassed. He could feel his pulse pounding, each step toward the gallery a slow, deliberate reminder of what he was about to do. He could picture it already, Jenna's face going pale, Eric's smug confidence crumbling. They had thought him oblivious, foolish. But tonight, he would show them just how wrong they'd been. He slipped into the gallery's main hall, hidden among early guests mingling by the large canvases and sculptures that Jenna had curated. His eyes scanned the crowd, watching the doors, waiting for the two of them to arrive. The tension buzzed through his veins, but it was not the helpless anger he had once felt. No, this was something else, something powerful, a calm control. Tonight, he was the one holding all the cards. Jenna arrived first, greeting guests with a smile, her laughter floating through the room like music. She was wearing the dress he'd seen her buy weeks ago, one she'd thought he'd never notice. But tonight, every detail was burned into his memory. She was a stranger to him now, her presence nothing more than a facade, a polished mask for the woman she had truly become. Then Eric entered, striding and confidently, greeting people with that same smug, self-assured smile that Mark had come to despise. The sight of him nearly broke Mark's control, but he clenched his fists, reigning in the fury. Tonight was not for outbursts or quick reactions. Tonight, he would be surgical, precise, and he would let them destroy themselves. He waited until the exhibit was in full swing. When the room was filled with patrons, Jenna and Eric at the height of their confidence, mingling without a worry in the world. Then, at the exact moment he had planned, Mark approached the microphone at the front of the room. He cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the crowd. Jenna turned, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw him standing there. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark began, his voice calm, controlled, carrying a weight that cut through the chatter. "Thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to take a moment to honor someone very special, someone who has dedicated herself to this gallery, to this community, and who has shown unwavering commitment in her own way." Jenna's face faltered, confusion flickering in her eyes as she glanced nervously at Eric, who was now standing rigid, the color draining from his face. Mark held their gazes, savoring the fear taking root, the cracks beginning to show in their carefully crafted masks. "I'd like to share something personal," Mark continued, holding up the thick folder in his hand. "Something that has affected me deeply. Something that involves both Jenna and her esteemed boss, Eric." A hush fell over the room, all eyes on Mark as he opened the folder and pulled out the first page. It was one of the incriminating messages, blown up so the words were visible to everyone. He held it up, turning so the crowd could see, the raw words of betrayal hanging in the air for everyone to witness. The silence was broken by gasps, murmurs, shocked whispers. Jenna's face turned a ghastly shade, her mouth opening and closing in horror. Eric looked equally stunned, his polished composure shattering as he glanced around, aware that his entire reputation was collapsing before his eyes. "This is just a taste of what I've gathered," Mark continued, his voice laced with ice. "For months, these two have deceived me, betrayed me, and lied to every single person in this room. Jenna, the woman I once thought I knew, and Eric, the man trusted to lead this gallery." He dropped the papers onto a nearby table, letting them scatter for everyone to see, a visual testament to their betrayal. The crowd began to murmur louder, judgmental gazes turning on Jenna and Eric, who looked as though they wanted to sink through the floor. Jenna reached out toward him, but Mark stepped back, his face a mask of disdain. "Don't," he said sharply, his voice low enough that only she could hear, but laced with enough venom to freeze her in place. "I'm done with your lies." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, the room erupting into chaos behind him. As he stepped out into the night air, a sense of release washed over him. The burden of the deception, the anger, the humiliation, all of it faded, leaving him lighter than he had felt in months. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a strange sense of calm. He had faced the truth, confronted his worst fears, and in doing so, he had reclaimed himself. Jenna and Eric would have to pick up the pieces, but that was no longer his concern. He had left them to deal with the mess they had created, the shame and judgment of their peers, the ruined careers, the fractured lives. As he walked away from the gallery, he didn't look back. His life with Jenna was over, that chapter closed. The pain, the betrayal, it no longer held power over him. He was free. In the days that followed, Mark began to rebuild. He moved out of the house, started fresh, poured himself into his work. The anger had burned itself out, replaced by a quiet strength he hadn't known he possessed. He had survived the worst, and now, he was free to create something new, something untouched by lies. Mark had discovered a new purpose, not revenge, not anger, but resilience. And as he stood on the threshold of his new life, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of possibility. The past was behind him, a closed book, and for the first time, he was ready to begin again.